My boss called me sweetie for 3 years, so I recorded everything and played it at the company retreat. The first time Marcus Castellano called me sweetie, I was presenting Q2 revenue projections to the executive team. I'd spent 6 weeks building the financial model that would guide our expansion strategy, coding custom algorithms to predict user growth across 12 international markets. My laptop connected to the conference room display, and I walked through each slide with precision earned from 5 years of software engineering experience. Marcus leaned back in his ergonomic chair, nodding along until I reached my recommendation slide. I proposed prioritizing the European market based on data showing 340% higher conversion rates than our current Southeast Asia focus. Marcus smiled and interrupted mid-sentence to say, "That's adorable, sweetie, but let's let the growth team handle strategy. You just keep those numbers looking pretty." The room went silent for 3 seconds before everyone laughed nervously and moved on. I stood there with my clicker raised, feeling heat crawl up my neck while my 18 pages of research evaporated into office air. Nobody acknowledged what happened, and the meeting continued as if Marcus had agreed with me instead of dismissing my analysis with a pet name. I convinced myself it was a fluke, some artifact of Marcus's upbringing, even though he was only 38, barely 6 years older than me. TechVista had been my dream job when they recruited me 9 months earlier. The startup had grown from 12 people to 200 employees across 3 buildings in 4 years. Marcus had founded the company after selling his previous startup for $60 million, and everyone in Silicon Valley knew his name. Working at TechVista meant equity that could actually be worth something, the chance to build products used by millions, and a salary that finally let me pay off student loans ahead of schedule. I'd left a stable Fortune 500 position because Marcus's vision for democratizing financial technology actually meant something to me. During interviews, Marcus talked about empowering underserved communities and building tools that gave regular people access to investment strategies previously reserved for the wealthy. He quoted statistics about wealth inequality and spoke passionately about using technology as an equalizer. I believed every word and accepted the offer the same day. Now I was standing in conference rooms being called sweetie while presenting complex financial analysis. The second time Marcus called me sweetie happened 3 weeks later during our weekly product review. I'd led development of our mobile authentication feature, coordinating between security, front-end engineers, and legal counsel to implement biometric login that complied with international privacy regulations. The feature launched on schedule and reduced user drop-off during account creation by 68%. I presented results with screenshots showing improved user flow and metrics demonstrating business impact. Marcus interrupted my third slide to say, "This is great work, sweetie. Really great. But honey, next time loop in the design team earlier so we don't end up with buttons that clash with our brand guidelines." I stared at him, processing that he'd used 2 diminutives in 1 sentence while ignoring that I'd already explained our design system compliance on slide 2. Kyle, our engineering director, jumped in to say the button colors were actually specified in our design documentation, and Marcus waved him off cheerfully, saying he was sure I'd figure it out next time. The meeting ended with Marcus praising my effort, while making it sound like I'd completed a school project, rather than delivered a feature generating $1.2 million in annual recurring revenue. I started paying attention to how Marcus addressed people after that meeting. During our next all-hands presentation, I kept a mental tally of his language patterns. When Kyle presented infrastructure updates, Marcus called him by name and asked detailed technical questions. When James from sales presented quarterly numbers, Marcus addressed him as James, or our sales director, and engaged seriously with his analysis. When Lisa from customer success presented user feedback, Marcus called her honey twice and sweetheart once, then summarized her 15-minute presentation by saying she'd shared some sweet stories about our users. When Rebecca from marketing presented our rebrand strategy, Marcus interrupted her 4 times to call her dear and suggest she was overthinking the creative stuff before assigning final decisions to Kyle, who had 0 marketing experience. The pattern was unmistakable once I started looking for it. Every woman in the company got diminutives, pet names, or infantilizing language. Every man got surnames, titles, or simple name usage. I went back to my desk and pulled up old recorded sessions from our company drive. TechVista recorded most meetings for remote employees, and I spent 3 hours watching Marcus's language patterns across 6 months of archived footage. I scheduled coffee with Rebecca the following week at the cafe across from our office. She arrived 15 minutes late, apologizing profusely while juggling her laptop bag and portfolio case. We ordered overpriced lattes and found a corner table away from other TechVista employees. I asked her directly if she'd noticed how Marcus addressed women differently than men, and Rebecca's entire body language shifted. She set down her cup carefully and looked at me with an expression between relief and exhaustion. She'd been tracking it mentally for 8 months, ever since Marcus called her princess during a board meeting in front of 3 investors. She'd tried bringing it up to our head of people operations, Amanda, who told her Marcus was just friendly and came from a culture where those terms were considered warm and personable. Rebecca had pushed back, explaining the language undermined her credibility with clients and made it difficult to be taken seriously as marketing director. Amanda suggested Rebecca was being oversensitive and reminded her that Marcus had personally approved her $30,000 salary increase last quarter, as if compensation could erase condescension. Rebecca's experience mirrored my growing frustration, but hearing it from someone else crystallized something forming in my mind. This wasn't personal sensitivity or misinterpreted intent. This was systematic diminishment of every woman's professional credibility, wrapped in Southern charm that Marcus wielded like a shield against criticism. I asked Rebecca if she'd be willing to document instances going forward, and she agreed immediately, relief flooding her features. She admitted she'd felt crazy for months, wondering if she was overreacting or manufacturing problems where none existed. Having someone else notice the same patterns validated her experience in a way that made her shoulders relax. We spent another hour comparing notes on specific incidents, finding eerie similarities in how Marcus dismissed our expertise while praising our effort and enthusiasm. By the time we left the cafe, we decided to loop in Lisa and see if her experience matched ours. We needed to know if this pattern extended beyond just the two of us, or if it was truly systemic across the entire company. Lisa met us for lunch the following week at a restaurant 20 minutes from the office. She worked remotely 2 days weekly and used her in-office time strategically, so coordinating schedules took effort. Lisa was 41, the oldest woman on the leadership team, with 15 years of customer success experience before joining TechVista. Before Rebecca or I could explain why we'd asked her to lunch, Lisa said, "If this is about Marcus's sexist language patterns, I've been documenting them for 6 months and have a spreadsheet with 238 instances." Rebecca and I exchanged looks while Lisa pulled out her phone and showed us a meticulously organized Google Sheet with columns for date, context, specific language used, witnesses present, and impact on her ability to do her job. She'd color-coded entries by severity, with red marking instances where Marcus's language had directly undermined her authority in front of clients or direct reports. 39 entries were red. Lisa explained she'd started documenting after Marcus called her sweetheart while she was de-escalating a situation with an angry enterprise client on a conference call. The client had explicitly asked to speak to her manager because he needed someone who actually makes decisions, not the secretary. Lisa had 17 years of experience handling difficult clients and had successfully resolved the issue within 20 minutes. But Marcus's language during the call had given the client ammunition to dismiss her expertise. She'd tried addressing it with Marcus directly after that call, explaining professionally that diminutive language undermined her credibility with customers. Marcus had responded by saying he called everyone pet names, that it was just his personality, and that Lisa should focus on building thicker skin instead of policing his word choices. He'd said this while literally patting her shoulder, as if comforting a child who'd scraped her knee. Lisa was done being patient about it. The three of us formed an unofficial alliance that day, sharing documentation methods and comparing notes weekly. I started keeping my own spreadsheet, modeled after Lisa's structure but adding columns for male colleagues' experiences in similar situations. I wanted quantitative data that couldn't be dismissed as perception or feelings. Within 2 weeks, the pattern was undeniable. Marcus called women by diminutives in 83% of professional interactions, compared to 0% for men. I started recording every meeting in early spring, 8 months after joining TechVista. California's two-party consent law meant I couldn't use recordings without informing participants. So I announced at the beginning of each meeting that I was recording for personal notes and asked if anyone objected. Nobody ever did. We recorded most meetings anyway for company records, and my personal recordings seemed like reasonable diligence. I bought a high-quality lapel microphone that connected to my phone and used an app that automatically transcribed audio in real time. The transcription feature became invaluable because it let me search for specific terms later. I could pull up every instance of Marcus saying sweetie, or honey, or dear, with timestamps and context. I could quantify exactly how many times he interrupted women versus men. I could track how many ideas proposed by women ended up implemented without credit. The data accumulated steadily, painting a picture that became harder to ignore with each passing week. Lisa, Rebecca, and I met regularly to compare documentation and discuss what we'd do with all this evidence once we had enough to make an irrefutable case. In late spring, I led development of our machine learning recommendation engine, the flagship feature that would differentiate TechVista from competitors. I'd spent 3 months coordinating between data science, product designers, and infrastructure engineers to build a system that analyzed user behavior and suggested personalized investment strategies. The technical complexity rivaled anything I'd worked on in my career, requiring custom neural networks and real-time processing of millions of data points. When we launched, the feature drove a 43% increase in user engagement and generated coverage in TechCrunch, Forbes, and the Wall Street Journal. Industry analysts called it innovative. Competitors started copying our approach within weeks. During our company all-hands meeting celebrating the launch, Marcus spent 10 minutes praising Kyle for overseeing technical implementation and thanking James for seeing the commercial potential. He mentioned me once, saying, "And of course, Sweetie worked really hard on this too," gesturing vaguely in my direction. I sat in the third row of our cafeteria-turned-auditorium, watching 200 people applaud for Kyle and James while my 3 months of leadership evaporated into background effort. I asked for a promotion after that launch, believing my track record spoke for itself. I delivered 3 major features in 9 months, each exceeding performance targets and generating measurable business impact. I scheduled a meeting with Marcus, preparing a document that outlined my contributions, my growth at the company, and my request to move from senior product manager to director of product. I'd researched salary ranges and knew my request was reasonable given my output. Marcus greeted me warmly, offering coffee and asking about my weekend. We made small talk for 5 minutes before I transitioned to the meeting's purpose. I handed him the promotion packet and walked through my rationale, highlighting specific achievements and explaining how the director role aligned with work I was already doing. Marcus listened attentively, nodding and making affirming sounds. When I finished, he reached across his desk and patted my hand gently, his touch lingering just long enough to feel patronizing. He said, "Sweetie, let's not get ahead of ourselves. You're doing great work, but you've only been here 9 months. Give it another year or 2 to really prove yourself, and then we can talk about growth opportunities." I pulled my hand back slowly, processing his response. Kyle had been promoted to VP of Engineering after 7 months. James had become Director of Sales after 5 months. Both delivered strong results, but neither had the measurable impact of my machine learning feature. I pointed this out to Marcus as diplomatically as possible, noting the timeline discrepancy and asking what specific milestones I needed to hit for promotion consideration. Marcus's expression shifted slightly, his warmth cooling into something more condescending. He explained that engineering and sales were different from product management, that those roles required faster advancement to retain talent in competitive markets. He said product management needed seasoning, and that I'd benefit from more time learning from senior leaders like him. When I asked if he could outline a concrete development plan with timeline and objectives, Marcus stood up to signal the meeting was ending. He said we'd revisit the conversation in 6 months and that I should focus on being a team player rather than chasing titles. I left his office with my promotion packet still in hand, understanding clearly that my contributions would never be valued equally to male colleagues doing equivalent or lesser work. That evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing recordings from the past months. I'd collected 43 instances of Marcus using diminutive language with me personally, and Lisa and Rebecca had shared their own growing documentation. Together, we had evidence spanning 11 months, covering hundreds of interactions and demonstrating clear patterns of discrimination. But evidence meant nothing without a platform, and Marcus controlled every internal channel. He was the founder, the CEO, the board chair, and the majority shareholder. Amanda in People Operations reported directly to him and had already proven she'd protect him over employees. Our board consisted of 3 investors who'd funded Marcus's previous company and seemed to view him as infallible. Every formal complaint channel led back to Marcus himself or to people whose careers depended on staying in his good graces. I needed a moment when Marcus couldn't control the narrative, when people who didn't owe him their livelihoods would see the evidence and form their own conclusions. The company retreat was scheduled for late June at a resort in Napa Valley, and that's when I'd make my move. Tech Vista hosted an annual event where all employees gathered for 3 days of strategic planning, team building, and celebration. This year's retreat had additional significance because we'd invited major investors who were considering leading our Series C funding round. Marcus had been courting Elevation Capital for months, trying to secure an $80 million investment that would accelerate our international expansion. The retreat agenda included a company culture presentation, where Marcus planned to showcase Tech Vista's values and working environment to convince investors we were building something sustainable. I volunteered to help organize the presentation, offering to compile video footage that demonstrated our collaborative culture and innovative work environment. Marcus loved the idea and gave me complete access to our archive of recorded meetings and company events. He wanted a highlight reel that made Tech Vista look like the perfect workplace, and I promised to deliver exactly that. What he didn't know was that I'd be delivering something very different when the moment came. I spent 3 weeks building 2 presentations. The official version contained exactly what Marcus wanted: employees collaborating enthusiastically, Marcus being charismatic and visionary, shots of our modern office space, and team events. The presentation ran 8 minutes and painted Tech Vista as a dynamic, inclusive workplace where innovation flourished. I sent this version to Marcus for approval, and he responded with enthusiastic praise, saying it captured our culture perfectly. The second presentation was the one I'd actually show at the retreat. I used the same editing software and visual style, but different content. I compiled every recorded instance of Marcus using diminutive language with female employees over the past 11 months. I included full context of each clip, showing serious professional moments where women presented complex work only to be dismissed with pet names. I added text overlays showing the data Lisa, Rebecca, and I had collected. Marcus used diminutive language with women 237 times across 78 recorded meetings, while using equivalent language with men 0 times. I showed instances where women's ideas were dismissed by Marcus, then later implemented and credited to men. The presentation ran 9 minutes and was devastating in its clarity. I didn't add commentary or emotional appeals. I let Marcus's own words, in his own voice, create the narrative. I showed him interrupting women 43 times across 10 meetings while interrupting men 3 times. I showed him attributing women's work to the team, while specifically praising men by name for equivalent contributions. I showed the pattern of diminishment so clearly that it couldn't be dismissed as interpretation or sensitivity. I watched the presentation 24 times, refining transitions and timing, making sure every clip had clear context, and that data visualization was simple enough to understand at a glance. I wanted investors to see what we lived with every day, presented with the same quantitative rigor they'd expect from a business proposal. By mid-June, I had both presentations ready. I uploaded the approved version to the shared company drive and kept the real version on my personal laptop, encrypted and backed up in 3 locations. Now, I just needed to wait for the retreat and execute my plan without getting caught before showtime. The retreat began on a Thursday, with team-building activities I found exhausting and pointless. We did trust falls and problem-solving exercises and a scavenger hunt through Napa vineyards, all designed to build camaraderie. Marcus was in his element, moving between groups with effortless charm, knowing everyone's names and asking personalized questions that made people feel seen. He had a genuine gift for making individuals feel important, which made his pattern of diminishing women even more insidious. It wasn't cartoonish villainy, but rather death by 1,000 cuts, each one delivered with a smile. I participated in activities while mentally rehearsing my plan for the following evening. The company culture presentation was scheduled for Friday at 6 p.m. after a full day of strategic planning sessions. Investors would be present, along with all employees and several members of the press who Marcus had invited to cover TechVista's growth story. The presentation would happen in the resort's main ballroom with professional AV setup. I'd already confirmed with the events team that I'd handle technical setup personally, arriving early to test equipment and load the presentation file. I arrived at the ballroom at 4:30 p.m., 90 minutes before the scheduled presentation. The AV tech was already there, running final checks on the projector, sound system, and lighting. I introduced myself and explained I'd be running the presentation from my laptop. He helped me connect everything, and we did a full test run using my approved version. Everything worked perfectly. The screen was massive, easily 15 feet wide, ensuring everyone in the ballroom would see clearly. Sound quality was excellent, meaning Marcus's voice would come through with perfect clarity. After the tech left at 5:15, I swapped the file on my laptop, replacing the approved presentation with my real version. I tested the first 30 seconds to confirm it loaded correctly, then closed the program and tried to calm my racing heart. Employees started filtering into the ballroom around 5:30, claiming seats and chatting casually. Investors arrived at 5:45, a group of 6 people from Elevation Capital led by their managing partner, Catherine Odom. Marcus worked the room like a political candidate, shaking hands and laughing at jokes, building rapport before the formal program began. The program started at 6 p.m. sharp with Marcus taking the stage to welcome everyone. He spoke for 15 minutes about TechVista's journey, our mission, and our vision for the future. He talked about building a company culture based on respect, innovation, and collaboration. He said TechVista's greatest asset was its people, and that he was proud of the inclusive environment they'd created together. The irony of his words wasn't lost on me as I sat in the third row with my laptop balanced on my knees, waiting for my cue. Marcus introduced the company culture presentation by saying he'd asked me to compile footage that showed what made TechVista special. He called me sweetie, as he gestured for me to join him on stage, and I heard several people in the audience chuckle affectionately. I walked to the front with my laptop, connected it to the AV system, and thanked Marcus for the introduction. He sat down in the front row next to Catherine Odom, confident and relaxed. I dimmed the lights, took a breath that felt like my last moment of safety, and started the presentation that would change everything. The first clip showed Marcus interrupting me during a product review meeting. My voice came through the speakers explaining our authentication features' impact on user retention, and then Marcus's voice cut me off mid-sentence to say, "That's great, sweetie, but next time loop in design earlier." The clip played for 8 seconds before transitioning to the next one. This showed Marcus calling Rebecca honey 3 times while dismissing her rebrand strategy, followed by him assigning final decisions to Kyle. The ballroom was silent. I could feel attention sharpening as people realized this wasn't the feel-good highlight reel they'd expected. The third clip showed Lisa being called sweetheart during her client call, and I'd included text overlay showing the client's subsequent demand to speak to her manager. I didn't look at Marcus or the audience. I kept my eyes on the screen, watching 11 months of documentation play out in ruthless sequence. The presentation moved through chronological sections, each one building the case more thoroughly. I showed Marcus's language patterns across 78 meetings with timestamps and frequency counts. I showed his attribution patterns, where women's ideas became team efforts, while men's ideas became individual achievements. At the 5-minute mark, I showed the clip of Marcus patting my hand and telling me to not get ahead of myself when I requested a promotion, followed by archival footage showing Kyle's promotion announcement after 7 months and James's after 5. I included my measurable contributions next to theirs, letting the data speak for itself. The ballroom remained absolutely silent, except for the audio playing through the speakers. I glanced at Marcus once and saw his face had gone completely rigid, jaw clenched and eyes fixed on the screen with an expression I couldn't quite read. Catherine Odom was leaning forward in her seat, taking notes on her phone. The final section showed the cumulative impact of Marcus's language patterns on business outcomes. I'd correlated his dismissal of women's recommendations with delayed implementation of profitable features. My European market analysis, dismissed as adorable, would have generated an estimated $4.3 million in additional revenue if implemented when I proposed it instead of 3 months later when Kyle suggested the same approach. The presentation ended with a simple black slide showing one sentence in white text. This is what 237 instances of diminutive language looks like over 11 months. The lights came back up and the ballroom remained silent for approximately 5 seconds. Then Catherine Odom started clapping. Not polite applause, but a slow, deliberate clap that cut through the quiet like a challenge. 2 other Elevation Capital investors joined her. Several Tech Vista employees started clapping tentatively, then more joined, and within seconds, half the ballroom was applauding, while the other half sat frozen in confusion or shock. Marcus remained seated in the front row, his face carefully neutral, but his hands gripped tightly in his lap. I disconnected my laptop from the AV system with trembling hands, my entire body flooded with adrenaline. Catherine stood up and walked to the front of the ballroom, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She thanked me for the illuminating presentation and asked if I could send the data files to her directly. I said yes and provided my email address. Catherine then turned to Marcus and asked if he'd like to respond to what everyone had just witnessed. The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade, and I watched Marcus calculate his options in real time. Marcus stood slowly, and I watched him cycle through micro-expressions, anger and embarrassment and calculation, before settling on his characteristic charm. He thanked me for sharing my perspective, and said he was surprised and concerned to learn that his friendly communication style had been experienced as diminishing. He said intentions mattered, that he'd never meant to undermine anyone, and that he valued all his employees equally regardless of gender. He said Tech Vista would take these concerns seriously and work with people operations to ensure everyone felt respected. His response lasted maybe 90 seconds and hit every note of a non-apology: acknowledge feelings, deflect responsibility, promise vague future action. Catherine let him finish, then asked a question that cut through his deflection like a scalpel. She said she'd heard him acknowledge intentions but wondered what he'd say about impact, given that the presentation had shown measurable business costs alongside the personal costs to female employees. She said intentions were interesting from a moral perspective, but irrelevant from an investment perspective, and right now she was trying to understand whether Tech Vista's leadership could be trusted to maximize returns. Marcus's charm faltered for just a moment, long enough for me to see genuine fear flash across his face. Elevation Capital's investment represented Tech Vista's path to unicorn status, the funding that would let us scale internationally and compete with established players. Losing that investment meant stagnation or potentially failure as competitors gained ground. Marcus recovered quickly, saying of course he understood the business implications and that he took full responsibility for creating a culture where talented people felt undervalued. He said he'd welcome Catherine's guidance on implementing meaningful changes and that this presentation had been a real wake-up call. Catherine smiled thinly and said she was glad to hear that because Elevation Capital took governance issues seriously and wouldn't invest in companies with systemic leadership problems. She suggested they continue this conversation privately, and Marcus agreed immediately. The ballroom started buzzing with conversation as people processed what had happened. Several employees approached me as I packed up my laptop, some thanking me quietly, others looking shell-shocked. I saw Amanda, our head of people operations, pushing through the crowd toward me with fury written across her face. Amanda pulled me into a side room off the ballroom and unleashed immediately, saying I'd embarrassed the company in front of investors and press, that I'd violated Marcus's trust by creating a hostile work environment, and that my actions constituted insubordination at minimum and possibly harassment. I listened to her entire tirade without interrupting, watching her face get progressively redder as she ran out of steam. When she finally paused for breath, I asked if she'd like to explain which part of showing Marcus's actual words, in context, constituted harassment. I asked if she'd reviewed any of the documentation I'd previously shared with her office, the complaints that were dismissed as oversensitivity. I asked if she understood that California law protected whistleblowers and that retaliating against me for reporting discrimination would expose Tech Vista to significant legal liability. Amanda's fury cooled into something more calculating. She said we should all take the weekend to cool down and that we'd discuss next steps on Monday. I agreed and left the room, finding Lisa and Rebecca waiting for me in the hallway. We didn't celebrate because none of us knew what consequences we'd face, but we acknowledged that at least the truth was visible now. By the following week, the tech press had the story. Someone, possibly one of the reporters at the retreat or maybe an employee, leaked details about my presentation and Marcus's response. TechCrunch ran a piece titled, Tech Vista Founder Faces Discrimination Allegations from Senior Employee. The article included quotes from anonymous sources and mentioned the retreat incident without showing actual footage. Within hours, the story spread across tech media. Journalists started reaching out to current and former Tech Vista employees, and more stories emerged. 3 women who'd left the company in the past 18 months went on record describing similar experiences with Marcus's condescending language and credit appropriation. One former employee shared emails where Marcus had dismissed her work in writing, calling her recommendations cute ideas, while praising a male colleague's nearly identical proposal as strategic thinking. The pattern was consistent across multiple people and time periods, making it difficult to dismiss as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. By Friday, Elevation Capital released a statement saying they were postponing their investment decision pending a thorough review of governance and culture concerns at TechVista. 2 other potential investors pulled out entirely. TechVista's board called an emergency meeting. I wasn't privy to what happened in that meeting, but Lisa had connections to one of the board members and heard that Catherine Odom had contacted them directly with a list of concerns and recommendations. The board faced a decision between protecting Marcus and preserving the company's ability to raise capital. By the following week, TechVista issued a press release announcing that Marcus Castellano would be transitioning from CEO to board chairman, taking a strategic advisory role, while the board conducted a search for new executive leadership. The release mentioned a commitment to evaluating company culture and ensuring all employees felt valued. It was corporate speak that avoided admitting wrongdoing while acknowledging something needed to change. The board appointed Kyle as interim CEO, which felt ironic given how he'd benefited from Marcus's favoritism, but at least it wasn't Marcus in daily management. More significantly, the board hired an outside firm to conduct a comprehensive culture audit and compensation review. Over the next 2 months, investigators interviewed every employee, reviewed documentation, and analyzed pay equity across the company. Their report, delivered in September, confirmed everything my presentation had shown and more. Women at TechVista were paid an average of 18% less than men in equivalent roles, were promoted 30% less frequently, and had their contributions attributed to team efforts at significantly higher rates. The report made 12 specific recommendations for remediation, including compensation adjustments, promotion reviews, and mandatory training for all leadership. The board implemented most recommendations within 3 months. My compensation was adjusted upward by $35,000, with an additional $28,000 in back pay for the period where I'd been underpaid relative to male peers. Rebecca and Lisa received similar adjustments. 4 women, including me, received promotions that had been previously denied. Amanda was quietly let go, and the board hired a new head of people operations with specific experience in discrimination prevention and equity initiatives. Marcus attended one board meeting I observed, looking uncomfortable and speaking only when directly asked questions. His influence had diminished significantly, and while he retained his board seat and equity, his ability to shape daily operations was effectively neutered. By November, Elevation Capital resumed their investment discussions with the new leadership team, eventually closing a $72 million Series C that valued TechVista at $600 million. Catherine Odom joined the board as part of the investment terms, bringing governance oversight that hadn't existed before. I stayed at TechVista through the transition and beyond, eventually taking the director role I'd originally requested. The company culture didn't transform overnight, and plenty of subtle biases persisted, but the most egregious patterns stopped. Women's contributions were credited appropriately. Compensation disparities were addressed systematically. Leadership learned that dismissive language carried consequences. Marcus sent me an email in December, 9 months after the retreat, apologizing for his past behavior and acknowledging that I'd been right to force accountability. The apology felt performative, written more to protect his reputation than from genuine growth, but at least it existed. I never responded because words meant nothing compared to the structural changes that had actually happened. 3 years later, I left TechVista to start my own company, taking Lisa and Rebecca with me, building the workplace we'd wished existed all along. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.